At 4:17 local time, the forward sonar console aboard the lead U.S. escort went silent for half a second. Then two cold shapes appeared beneath the carrier's wake. They were not fishing boats. They were not commercial traffic. They were not harmless surface noise bouncing through the warm waters of the Strait of Hormuz. These were submerged contacts moving slowly, cleanly, and with purpose, just outside the acoustic shadow of a U.S. Navy carrier formation. Inside the operations center, nobody needed a dramatic announcement. The watch officer leaned closer to the display. Possible submerged contact bearing 084, range closing. 3 seconds later, a second track appeared. Second contact bearing 091, same depth band, same speed. The room changed instantly. Above them, the aircraft carrier kept moving through the narrow waterway. Flight deck lights were dimmed. Escort ships held their formation. The entire strike group cut through the dark water like a floating city made of steel. On the surface, everything looked calm, controlled, routine. Underwater, it was no longer routine. The sonar team began refining the tracks. Passive array first, no active pulse yet. The Navy does not announce itself into the ocean unless it has to. It listens, it compares, it waits for the other side to make the first mistake. The first contact was moving just above creep speed. The second held a slightly deeper layer, trailing behind in a way that looked far too organized to be random. Not drifting, not lost, not accidental. The acoustic signature was faint but not faint enough. A senior sonar technician adjusted his headset. Blade rate doesn't match regional diesel traffic, low-frequency machinery noise, possible reactor-powered boat. That sentence landed heavily. Russian. Nobody said it loudly at first. They did not need to. The profile was already building itself on the screen. Outside, the sea stayed calm in that suspicious way the Gulf can look calm, while everything below the surface becomes complicated. The carrier's wake stretched behind her like a white scar in the dark. Farther out, one of the escort destroyers adjusted course by 2 degrees, just enough to improve sonar coverage without looking nervous. 2 degrees in the Navy can say more than an entire press briefing. On the bridge, the captain received the update without moving from his chair. 2 submerged contacts, possible Russian, closing from port quarter. He looked at the tactical display. Track everything, say less, let them speak first. That was the tone. No shouting, no theater, no one grabbing a microphone to announce history. Just trained sailors doing math, while several $1 billion of American naval power moved through one of the most sensitive maritime choke points on Earth. At 4:20, the carrier air wing shifted posture. Not launch, not yet. But ready crews started moving. Deck personnel cleared unnecessary equipment. A pair of F/A-18 Super Hornets sat chained under dim red deck lighting, their canopies catching the glow from the island. On the nearest destroyer, the MH-60R Seahawk crew was already walking toward the aircraft. Anti-submarine operations are not glamorous. They are patient, technical, and quietly disrespectful in the most professional way possible. You do not chase a submarine like a movie villain. You build a cage around it until it realizes the ocean is no longer private. At 4:23, surface radar added a new problem. 3 contacts appeared from the northern sector, moving south at measured speed. Not merchant tracks, not tankers. Their radar returns were sharp, spaced out, and disciplined. The Surface Watch called it in. 3 surface contacts bearing 340, closing slowly. Formation spread. The timing was too clean to ignore. 2 submarines below, 3 naval ships above. Someone on the Russian side had apparently decided that a U.S. carrier group in Hormuz needed company, which is thoughtful in the same way a shark circling your surfboard is technically marine life. The American formation did not turn away. That mattered. A carrier strike group does not flinch because something appears on radar. It evaluates, it documents, it prepares. The difference between fear and discipline is that discipline has checklists. At 4:25, the first bridge-to-bridge hail went out toward the surface contacts. Unknown naval vessels, this is United States Navy warship conducting lawful transit. Maintain safe distance and identify yourself. No reply. A second hail followed. Still nothing. Inside the operations center, the electronic warfare console began logging emissions from the northern contacts. Low-power radar sweeps, search mode. Not targeting quality, not yet. But enough to prove they were watching the carrier group while pretending not to hear it. Classic. Because nothing says innocent transit like ignoring international radio calls while your submarines quietly move toward an aircraft carrier's blind quarter. At 4:27, sonar updated the plot. The first submerged contact changed depth by 50 feet and edged inward. Its bearing shifted closer to the carrier's port side. The second contact remained deeper, trailing behind like quiet backup. The watch officer kept his voice flat. Contact 1 is maneuvering, CPA decreasing. Closest point of approach. That was the number everyone cared about. Not nationality, not slogans, not public statements. Distance, bearing, speed, depth. Geometry at sea. Geometry is where politics goes to become very honest. The captain stood. Set condition 3 across the screen. ASW teams ready. Seahawks standby launch. Across the formation, the posture changed quietly and efficiently. No alarms echoing across the deck. No panic flooding the radios. Just doors opening, sailors moving, systems waking up. The Seahawk rotors began to turn. Below the surface, the Russian submarine kept closing. At 4:29, sonar sharpened the track again. Contact bearing 086, closing, depth changing. The captain looked at the display, then out through the dark bridge glass toward the water. The Russians had not made a hostile move. But underwater intent does not need a headline to become a serious concern. At 4:30 local time, the surface picture changed. The 3 Russian naval vessels turned together. Not wide, not random, not the kind of lazy correction a merchant captain makes while searching for coffee. Their headings shifted in sequence, clean enough to make every surface warfare officer in the room stop blinking for half a second. The first Russian contact moved ahead on the outer edge of the formation. The second slid lower, angling toward the U.S. carrier screen. The third held back, slower and quieter, sitting just outside the main line like it had one job. Watch, listen, collect. The operations center tagged them fast. Surface contact Alpha, Russian combatant, possible destroyer or frigate class. Surface contact Bravo, smaller strike-capable vessel, higher speed profile. Surface contact Charlie, possible electronic support platform. Above the water, the Russians were arranging pressure. Below the water, 2 submerged contacts were still riding close to the American carrier's wake. That was the problem. 1 contact gets attention, 2 contacts get caution. 5 contacts moving in layered geometry around a carrier strike group gets everyone's full professional interest. On the bridge of the lead U.S. destroyer, the captain watched the plot build in real time. The carrier remained centered on its transit lane. Steady speed, steady heading. No sudden turn that could be mistaken for panic or provocation. That part mattered. In a place like Hormuz, every movement is a sentence. Every radar sweep is punctuation. Every course change gets read, misread, filmed, clipped, translated, and debated online by someone who thinks a destroyer turns like a pickup truck. The captain keyed the internal circuit. Maintain formation. No aggressive maneuvering. Log all Russian movements. The reply came back instantly. Logging all tracks. Electro-optical cameras recording. At 4:32, another bridge-to-bridge hail went out. Russian naval vessels, this is United States Navy warship, conducting lawful transit. Maintain safe distance and identify your intentions. Static. No answer. A second hail followed on an international maritime frequency. Still nothing. The Russian ships kept moving. Surface contact Bravo increased speed by 4 knots, pushing toward a position off the carrier group's starboard-forward arc. Not close enough to force a collision risk. Not close enough to justify a direct response, but close enough to force decisions. That is how gray zone pressure works. It does not kick the door open. It leans on the handle and smiles like nothing is happening. At 4:34, the electronic warfare team picked up a radar sweep from Alpha. Low-power surface search radar, bearing 341, painting the formation. The watch officer looked up. Targeting quality signal negative. Search mode only. Only. That word does a lot of work at sea. Search radar means they are looking. Targeting quality radar means the situation may be moving into a far more serious category. The distance between those 2 modes can be technical, legal, and psychological all at once. The Russians knew that. The U.S. Navy knew that. Everyone in the room knew the game was being played 1 millimeter below the line. The captain did not raise his voice. Keep it classified as probing behavior. Do not escalate. On deck, the MH-60R Seahawk finished spinning up. Rotor wash rolled across the steel, flattening spray and sending deck crew into practiced positions. The helicopter's mission was simple. Get above the suspected submarine track, extend the carrier's eyes, and remind the Russian boats that the ocean was about to become very crowded. At 4:36, the Seahawk lifted off. It rose clean from the destroyer's flight deck, banked left, and dropped toward the dark water ahead of the formation. Its dipping sonar was ready. Sonobuoys were loaded. The crew inside looked like people who had rehearsed this exact problem so many times that fear had been replaced by procedure. Anti-submarine operations are pressure without spectacle. You do not need a loud moment to dominate. You listen, you map, you predict, then you place sensors exactly where the other side does not want them. At 4:38, the first sonobuoy entered the water, then a second, then a third, small splashes on the surface, big consequences underneath. The data began feeding back almost immediately. The first Russian submarine adjusted course slightly. Not much, just enough to prove it had noticed the net being cast around it. Which was polite, really. If you're trying to be invisible, reacting to the thing searching for you is generally considered poor customer service. Meanwhile, Surface Contact Bravo changed heading again. CPA with the outer U.S. escort dropped below 4 nautical miles. The bridge watch called it out. Bravo is tightening. Closest point of approach now, 3.8 nautical miles and decreasing. On the carrier's island, flight deck operations shifted into a harder rhythm. Not emergency launch, not yet. But aircraft were moved into faster readiness. Plane captains checked tie-downs. Yellow shirts signaled with sharp, clipped movements. The deck still looked controlled, but the tempo had changed. Below the surface, the second Russian submarine held deeper. That bothered the operations center more than the first. The first boat was reacting. The second was waiting. At 4:41, the Seahawk dropped lower and began its first search leg. Its sensors scanned the water ahead of the carrier's port quarter. On the tactical display, the suspected submarine track sharpened, drifted, then sharpened again. Contact 1 bearing stable, range decreasing. The captain folded his arms. Do they have favorable geometry? A short pause. Not confirmed, but they are moving toward a better position. That was enough to change the room. Not panic, not fear. Focus. The kind of focus that turns sailors into instruments. At 4:43, the Russian surface ship spread wider. Alpha held back, still emitting. Bravo continued its forward angle. Charlie remained quiet, almost certainly listening to every radar, radio, and electronic whisper it could collect. Classic theater. Make noise on the surface. Hide the real move underneath. The problem for Russia was that the U.S. Navy had seen this movie before, and frankly, the sequel was not improving. At 4:44, sonar reported the update everyone had been waiting for. Submerged Contact 1 is ascending. Depth change confirmed. Bearing 085, closing toward carrier port side. Inside the operations center, all eyes moved to the tactical display. The surface ships were the noise. The real move was underneath it. At 4:45 local time, the carrier strike group stopped simply watching and started shaping the battlefield. From the outside, it did not look dramatic. No munitions launched, no warning display across the water, no sailor sprinting across the deck like a disaster movie with bad consultants. It was quieter than that. Inside the operations center of the lead U.S. destroyer, the tactical display tightened into one connected picture. Surface tracks, submerged contacts, radar emissions, acoustic returns, helicopter data, carrier heading, escort spacing, everything was feeding into the same network. Aegis was awake. And when Aegis wakes up, it does not panic. It calculates. The 3 Russian surface ships were still spread north of the formation. Alpha continued painting the carrier group with low-power search radar. Bravo was pushing forward in an aggressive angle off the starboard arc. Charlie stayed back, probably collecting every electronic signal the Americans allowed it to hear. Allowed. That was the key word. The U.S. Navy knew it was being watched, so it controlled what could be seen. Radar output stayed disciplined, radio traffic stayed minimal. Defensive systems remained ready, but quiet. The formation did not suddenly light up every emitter it had, because that would be exactly what the Russians wanted. If Moscow wanted a free tour of an American carrier strike group's electronic playbook, it was going to be disappointed. At 4:47, the MH-60R Seahawk crossed ahead of the carrier's port quarter and dropped another sonobuoy into the water. The buoy hit the surface with a small white splash, then disappeared into the dark. Seconds later, its signal joined the grid. Sonobuoy 4 is live, Contact 1 bearing refining. Contact 2 still deep, holding distance. The first Russian submarine had moved higher in the water column. Still submerged, still quiet. But now close enough to be tactically interesting in the worst possible way. Its course was not a direct hostile run. That mattered. But it was also not moving away. It was sliding toward a geometry that made every anti-submarine officer in the room very aware of his own breathing. At 4:49, the destroyer's sonar team shifted from passive tracking to a controlled active pulse. One pulse. Then silence. The sound rolled through the water, bounced off steel, current, temperature layers, and the hard shape of something trying very hard not to be noticed. The return came back clean enough. Contact 1 confirmed. Submerged. Bearing 086. Range closing. There it was. Not a rumor. Not a ghost. Not some innocent whale having the worst morning of its life. A submarine. Probably Russian. For a submarine, being found is embarrassing. Being found by a destroyer, a helicopter, and a growing fence of sonobuoys is less of a stealth operation and more of a career counseling session. At 4:50, the captain gave the next order. Classify Contact 1 as submerged military contact. Maintain release authority tight. Continue acoustic tracking. Release authority tight. That meant no one uses anything unless the rules of engagement are fully met. It did not mean relax, it did not mean hesitate. It meant hold the line with one hand on the leash. Above the formation, the carrier air wing began to move. Two F/A-18 Super Hornets were brought to launch readiness. Then two more. Deck crews worked under red and amber lights, bodies moving in precise choreography around aircraft prepared for combat air patrol. Nobody rushed. Rushing gets people hurt on flight decks. Steam curled from the catapults. The carrier was not trying to look angry. It was simply making options available. At 4:53, Surface Contact Bravo made its next move. The Russian ship adjusted course again, cutting toward a line that could force an American escort to either hold steady or give way. The U.S. destroyer held steady. No dramatic turn, no horn, no theatrical display, just steady heading and cameras locked on. Bravo CPA, now 2.9 nautical miles. The captain looked at the display. Bridge to bridge, one more warning. The hail went out. Russian vessel, you are maneuvering unsafely near United States naval vessels conducting lawful transit. Alter course immediately. For the first time, the Russians answered. The reply came in clipped English. United States warship, you are operating in proximity to Russian naval exercises. Recommend you change course. The operations center stayed quiet for one beat. Then someone at a console muttered, just low enough to remain almost professional. That is adorable. The captain did not smile. Respond. The U.S. reply was calm. Russian vessel, this formation is conducting lawful transit. We will maintain course and speed. Unsafe maneuvers are being recorded. That was not just a message, it was a legal document with a radio frequency. At 4:56, the first pair of Super Hornets launched, the catapult released, and the aircraft snapped into the dark sky, afterburners glowing orange against the horizon. A second jet followed seconds later. They climbed fast, turning into a protective arc above the carrier group. Now the Russians had a new problem. This was no longer a surface game. It was air, surface, and subsurface all at the same time. At 4:58, the Seahawk sensor operator marked a shift in Contact 1. Submerged Contact 1 slowing. Slight turn outward. Good. But not enough. Contact 2, the deeper submarine, remained steady. It had not reacted to the active pulse. It had not changed course. It was still sitting deeper, quieter, and more patient than the first. That was the contact the captain kept watching. At 500, Surface Contact Alpha increased radar power. The electronic warfare team caught it instantly. Alpha radar emission spike. Possible transition toward targeting quality data. Not confirmed. The weapons officer turned. Recommend elevated defensive readiness. The captain answered without delay. Approved. Defensive only. No illumination unless required. Aegis updated the picture again. The Russian ships were tagged. Their radar behavior was logged. Their course changes were stored. Their timing was captured down to the second. The submarines were mapped by acoustic returns and sonobuoy data. The aircraft overhead were now holding station. The Russians had come in trying to test an American carrier group. Instead, they were being measured. At 5:02, Contact 1 finally turned away, angling out of the carrier's port side risk zone. A small release moved through the operations center, but nobody relaxed, because Contact 2 was still there. Deep, slow, quiet. At 5:03, sonar updated the track. Submerged Contact 2 changing depth. Closing slightly. The captain looked at the display. One submarine had backed away. The other kept coming, and that was the mistake. At 5:04 local time, the second Russian submarine crossed the invisible line. Not a line on a map. Not a border. Not a political claim. Not one of those convenient arguments people invent later when the footage looks bad. This line was tactical. Distance, bearing, depth, speed, aspect, angle, position relative to the carrier's port side. Underwater, those numbers matter more than flags. They tell the difference between shadowing, probing, and preparing for something far more serious. Inside the operations center, the sonar plot sharpened. Submerged Contact 2, bearing 088, range decreasing, depth changing. The watch officer did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every person in that room understood what the contact was doing. The first submarine had already turned away after being boxed by the Seahawk and sonobuoys. But the second boat had stayed deeper, quieter, and more patient. Now it was rising into a depth band that gave it better tactical options. Not proof of a hostile act, but enough to get everyone's full attention. The captain stepped closer to the display. Does Contact 2 have favorable geometry? The anti-submarine warfare coordinator answered carefully. Potential geometry developing. No confirmed launch activity. No hostile act. That was the razor's edge. Potential was not permission to act. Suspicion was not a release order. The U.S. Navy does not survive tense moments by guessing loudly. It survives by turning chaos into procedure. The captain said, "Hold release authority tight, build the box." At 5:06, the MH-60R Seahawk dropped lower over the carrier's port quarter. Its crew released another sonar buoy, then banked hard across the projected path of the submarine. On the tactical display, the buoys formed an acoustic fence, a curved barrier of listening points across the water ahead of the Russian boat. The message was clear. You are not invisible. A U.S. destroyer adjusted course by 3 degrees, placing itself in a better shielding position between the submarine track and the carrier. It was not dramatic from the outside, just a gray ship turning slightly in dark water. But tactically, it was a body block. The escort was putting steel between the carrier and the risk. That is what destroyers are built to do. At 5:08, the surface picture tried to get loud again. Russian surface contact Bravo increased speed and angled toward the outer American escort, almost like it wanted the entire room to look upward instead of down. Alpha kept its radar emissions active. Charlie remained farther back, still listening. It was a familiar trick. Make noise on the surface, move the sharper piece underneath. The problem was that the U.S. Navy had enough eyes for both. Aegis kept the surface ships tagged. Electro-optical cameras recorded their headings. Electronic warfare stations logged every emission. Overhead, the Super Hornets widened their patrol arc. Not threatening, not diving, just present. Presence is a language every naval vessel understands. At 5:10, the P-8 Poseidon arrived on station. High above the water, nearly invisible against the thinning pre-dawn sky, the Maritime Patrol aircraft began feeding data into the network. Its sensors widened the battlefield instantly. What had been a close-range anti-submarine problem became a layered hunt. The Poseidon released a new sonobuoy pattern ahead of Contact 2. One splash, then another, then another. Within seconds, the submarine's projected route tightened on the display. The Russian boat was no longer a ghost. It was a track with a timestamp, a bearing, a depth estimate, and a shrinking list of bad choices. For a submarine, that is a terrible morning. At 5:12, the U.S. destroyer transmitted an acoustic warning. Submerged contact operating near United States naval vessels. You are maneuvering unsafely. Alter course immediately. No response. Of course, there was no response. Submarines do not usually answer awkward questions when they are busy pretending they are not there. So the destroyer answered for it. A controlled active sonar pulse went out through the water. This one was stronger than the first. Not an attack, not an engagement, but unmistakable. A hard acoustic spotlight across the Russian submarine's hull. In the operations center, the return came back bright. Contact 2 confirmed. Range refining, still closing. The captain's jaw tightened. A second pulse rolled through the water. This time, Contact 2 reacted. A slight speed change. Then a depth adjustment. Small, careful, but visible. That reaction told the room everything it needed to know. They heard it. They knew they were held. At that point, the Russian submarine was less a stealth platform and more a very expensive rumor with coordinates. At 5:15, the weapons officer gave the quiet update. ASW helicopter has defensive solution if required. The Seahawk was now orbiting above the contact zone. Sensors down, crew focused. Defensive options available if the situation crossed the line. Available did not mean used. That distinction kept the Strait of Hormuz from becoming a headline nobody wanted to read. The captain gave no new release order. Maintain defensive posture, no release unless hostile act is confirmed. That was restraint, not weakness, not hesitation. Restraint backed by radar, aircraft, sonar, destroyers, and several thousand sailors who had no interest in being impressed by underwater theater. At 5:17, Contact 2 slowed. For 5 seconds, the track nearly froze. Then it changed depth again. The entire operations center watched. If it turned inward, the next phase would become uglier. If it turned away, the encounter could end without a single munition being used. The contact drifted, held, then finally angled out. Contact 2 changing course, bearing opening. No one cheered. Professionals do not celebrate until the risk is outside the envelope. The Seahawk kept orbiting. The Poseidon kept tracking. The destroyer held its shielding position. The carrier continued forward, steady and massive, as if the ocean itself had been expected to move around it. At 5:19, Russian surface contact Bravo reduced speed. Alpha's radar emissions dropped back to lower power. Charlie widened its distance. The surface pressure was loosening because the underwater move had failed. At 5:21, sonar confirmed the final shift. Contact 2 opening range, descending, moving away from carrier track. Only then did the captain step back from the display. The Russians had come close enough to make their point. The U.S. Navy had made a larger one. They came in trying to test the carrier group. They left having tested every sensor pointed back at them. At 5:22 local time, the Russian formation began to open, not dramatically. No apology over bridge-to-bridge radio. No sudden turn that could be clipped into a headline and replayed with dramatic music for the evening audience back home. Just distance. Surface contact. Bravo eased off first, dropping speed and widening its angle away from the outer U.S. escort. Alpha reduced radar emissions, no longer pressing its search pattern against the carrier group. Charlie, the quiet electronic support vessel, drifted farther back, still listening, but no longer close enough to pretend it was shaping the encounter. Below the surface, Contact 2 continued opening range. That was the one everyone cared about. The Russian submarine that had pushed closest to the carrier's portside risk zone was now descending and turning away from the strike group's track. The Seahawk stayed above it, holding a wide orbit. The P-8 Poseidon remained high overhead. The sonobuoy field kept listening. The U.S. Navy did not trust a turn until the math confirmed it. At sea, intentions are interesting. Bearings are better. Inside the operations center, the sonar supervisor watched the numbers update. Contact 2, range opening, depth increasing, no further closing maneuver. The watch officer nodded. Maintain track until outside threshold. No one relaxed yet. That is the part movies usually get wrong. There is no instant celebration when a risky contact turns away. There is just more tracking, more logging, more waiting for the next bad idea to appear on a screen. At 5:25, the carrier continued on course. Same heading, same speed, same calm, massive presence moving through Hormuz like nothing beneath the water had tried to rewrite the morning. That was the message. The Russian ships had adjusted. The American carrier had not. On the flight deck, the Super Hornets remained airborne in combat air patrol, carving quiet arcs above the formation. Their job was not to chase the Russian ships. Their job was to make sure nobody confused American restraint with a lack of options. That mistake has a long and unpopular history. At 5:28, bridge-to-bridge radio came alive again. A Russian voice, clipped and controlled, transmitted across the open frequency. United States vessels, maintain safe navigation. Russian naval units are conducting routine operations. Routine. That word floated across the bridge like a joke nobody needed explained. Routine operations do not usually involve submarines sliding toward a carrier's port quarter while surface ships squeeze the screen from above. But diplomacy has always had a talent for making tense things sound like paperwork. The U.S. reply was short. Russian vessels, this is United States Navy warship. Your unsafe maneuvers have been recorded. We are maintaining course and speed. Recorded. That was the sharp edge. Every radar emission, every course change, every acoustic return, every ignored hail, every underwater maneuver, logged, time-stamped, packaged into a tactical record. The Russians had arrived hoping to pressure a carrier strike group. They left behind a library. Not exactly the souvenir Moscow wanted from Hormuz. At 5:31, surface contact Bravo crossed back behind Alpha, widening the formation and reducing immediate pressure on the American escort line. Charlie turned north by several degrees. Alpha maintained parallel distance but stopped closing. The surface trap was done. Underwater, Contact 1 had already faded deeper and farther out. Contact 2 remained trackable, but no longer positioned as an immediate concern. The Seahawk crew reported in. Submerged contact opening, no hostile indication, continuing surveillance. The captain answered, hold station 5 more minutes, then recover. 5 more minutes. Because professionalism is often just patience with better equipment. At 5:36, the first Super Hornet pair shifted to a wider patrol pattern. The second pair stayed closer to the carrier. No munitions were used. No long-range systems left their cells. No undersea payload entered the water. Close-in defense systems stayed silent. Launch cells stayed closed. And that was the point. The U.S. Navy had forced the pressure back without turning the Strait of Hormuz into a spectacle. Somewhere in a Russian operations center, officers were probably writing their own version of the morning. Routine patrol? Professional interaction? Safe distance maintained? Everyone behaved. Sure. And somewhere in an American intelligence cell, analysts were about to review acoustic signatures, radar behavior, formation timing, submarine reactions to active sonar, and the exact moment Russian confidence turned into Russian course correction. That is the part most people never see. A standoff like this is not only about who turns away first, it is about who learns more while giving away less. And on that score, the carrier group walked out ahead. At 5:41, the Seahawk returned to the destroyer's flight deck. Rotors slowed under amber light. The crew stepped out tired but calm, carrying data that mattered more than any dramatic speech. At 5:44, the P-8 Poseidon confirmed both submerged contacts were outside the immediate defensive envelope. At 5:47, the carrier strike group returned to normal transit posture. Normal in this case meaning heavily protected, fully alert, and still watched by every sensor that could be pointed at the horizon. The log entry was clean. No munitions used, no collision, no confirmed hostile release. Multiple unsafe maneuvers recorded. Russian submerged contacts tracked and escorted away from the carrier screen. That was the official shape of it. But the real story was simpler. Russian submarines and surface vessels tried to pressure a U.S. aircraft carrier in Hormuz. They created noise above the water, movement beneath it, and just enough ambiguity to test American nerves. The U.S. Navy answered with sonar, aircraft, discipline, and a very clear refusal to blink. A carrier is not just a ship. It is a moving fortress connected to destroyers, helicopters, fighter jets, satellites, maritime patrol aircraft, submarines, and thousands of sailors trained to stay calm while someone else experiments with terrible decision-making. By 5:50, the Russian formation was still visible on radar, but it was no longer shaping the encounter. The American carrier was. So here's the question. If a Russian submarine gets that close to a U.S. carrier in Hormuz, should the Navy push it away more aggressively? Or is calm restraint the smarter tool? Drop your take in the comments, because out here, the side that panics first usually loses. And this time, the U.S. Navy did not blink. Russia did.